an election might just derail that process rather than being a credible incremental pathway. There will be a time for election. I just don't think it is now.
Hello and welcome to episode 29 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. It's Friday, May 30, and today I'm talking to University of Stirling Senior Lecturer in International Politics, Monalisa Adhikari, about Myanmar developments at this week's Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, Summit in Malaysia. But before Mona joins us, let's touch on some more tragic news about Rohingya asylum seekers. I'll provide just a sample of this week's conflict updates, and then let's set some context for that ASEAN meeting. As covered in Frontier's Monday daily briefing newsletter, the United Nations Refugee Agency said last Friday that the sinking of two boats off the Myanmar coast earlier this month could have killed 427 Rohingya refugees. The agency added that there are reports that a third boat carrying 188 Rohingya people was intercepted leaving Myanmar this month, and it's unclear what happened to it. On Thursday, 26 Rohingya rights groups together decried the, quote, regional inaction and global neglect of the Rohingya people, saying that both the capsized boats had left from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where around 1 million displaced Rohingya still live in dire conditions in underfunded camps without basic rights or opportunities. Last week, Bangladesh's National Security Advisor, Khalilur Rahman, said that the interim government in Bangladesh had opened informal communication channels with the Arakan Army, the group that now controls the Myanmar-Bangladesh border and the homelands of the majority of the displaced Rohingya. He also said that the government remains engaged with the Myanmar military's State Administration Council, or SAC, to pursue a long-term solution to the Rohingya crisis, including potential support for a proposed United Nations-led humanitarian corridor in Rakhine State, even though the Bangladesh armed forces do not support it. Then, yesterday, Bangladesh recalled its ambassador to Myanmar, Monawar Hossain, though the country's interim leader, Muhammad Yunus, said this recalling had nothing to do with any kind of diplomatic row between Bangladesh and Myanmar. Hossain was appointed during the previous government of Sheikh Hasina, which was overthrown in a popular uprising, and his replacement has not yet been announced. And quickly on conflict updates. Fighting has raged across the country for yet another week, with the Myanmar military killing dozens of civilians in indiscriminate airstrikes. In one horrific instance, the Air Force targeted a wedding, killing the bride, a child, and others. But apart from these atrocities against civilians, there have been several military incidents of note this week. Fighting continues on the western frontier of Ayeyarwady and Bago regions as the Arakan Army continues its offensives, and a 600-soldier-strong force of the Myanmar Army is fighting to gain road access into the lucrative Pakant jade mining hub. But let's keep this to just three main conflict updates. The first one, in Karen State, resistance forces led by the Karen National Liberation Army, KNLA, achieved several victories in Myawaddy Township as they slowly try to choke out the Myanmar military soldiers in that area. Of significant note, on May 27, resistance forces ambushed a military column of around 100 soldiers sent to reinforce a camp about 40 kilometres from Myawaddy town. The column broke apart. The KNLA and allies took 10 prisoners and confiscated munitions. There are several videos of that operation circulating online, generating a combined tens of thousands of positive reactions by critics of the military. Second, in northern Shan State, the Ta'an National Liberation Army, TNLA, has suffered more losses this week as the military continues its push to take back the territory and towns that it lost to the TNLA during Operation 1027. The military is currently aiming to retake Nangcho, a junction town that it has bombed intensely since losing it. The TNLA has been losing ground and camps since the military walked back into Lashio with Chinese support. But the TNLA has been remaining firm in refusing to capitulate and sign a ceasefire with the regime. On Wednesday, TNLA officials said that the Chinese government is still outright blocking shipments into its territory, even though it's trading at border crossings with other ethnic armed organisations like the Shan State Progress Party, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, and the Kachin Independence Army, KIA. Third, the long, drawn-out campaign by the KIA and its allies to take the strategic town of Bamor has been reignited after the resistance forces destroyed 2 military helicopters reinforcing Bamor last week. The KIA claims it's captured several military positions in the town since then, including the Win Light Hotel, and it has now more firmly surrounded the Military Operations Command 21 headquarters, which is considered the main base for the army in the town. If Bamor falls to the resistance, it would be a huge blow to the military, and you can listen back to episode 11 of this podcast for an interview with Ka San Lui all about that ongoing battle. Now, just a quick reminder before getting into the ASEAN Summit and our interview with Monalisa. Remember, there are many benefits to joining Frontier Myanmar as a member. For those of you who already subscribe, well, you're the reason we can support our journalists and publish the feature stories, podcasts, and the newsletters that we do. So thank you so much. But if you're still on the fence about becoming a member, consider this. For less than $1 a day, you can have access to daily briefing, news summaries, media monitoring, reports and translations, fortnightly political insider newsletters, and so much more. Frontier even has a tailored media monitoring service for clients with an interest in a particular topic. Head to frontiermyanmar.net/membership and check out the 3 membership tiers that you can choose from. Okay, thanks for that. Now, back to the ASEAN Summit. It was held in Malaysia this week with meetings from Sunday to Tuesday. Organisations released some new reports coinciding with that event, and they actually help to remind us how important it is that neighbouring countries take positive action on Myanmar's political and military crisis. So I want to cover those too. The UN's Human Rights Office released its latest report on Monday, outlining the continuing devastation wrought by the Myanmar military's 2021 coup and the widespread conflict. The report claimed that military operations have killed more civilians in the first 5 months of 2025 than in any other year since the coup. The economy has lost an estimated $94 billion, the kyat has lost 40% of its value, and currently over half of the Myanmar population lives below the poverty line. It also noted that more opium and synthetic drugs are now produced in Myanmar than in any other country in the world. 2 days before that UN report, activist group Justice for Myanmar published a long list of companies from ASEAN member states that do business with the Myanmar military. Several of those companies are state-owned, and they have direct or indirect links to deforestation, jet fuel imports, digital surveillance and repression, and more. That report succinctly links those businesses to atrocities and breaches of human rights caused by the Myanmar military. Both of those reports, by the way, are linked to in the show notes. Now, there's no spoiler here, but I don't think anyone at the ASEAN Summit read those reports, as the summit failed to produce anything really meaningful on Myanmar. Frontier published its leading editorial on Wednesday after the conclusion of the summit, titled, "ASEAN is Sliding into Irrelevance on Myanmar." The editorial argues that ASEAN is confronting Myanmar with a mixture of immobility and wishful thinking, while others are intervening more effectively to the military's benefit. Do jump online and read that editorial. It's in the show notes. It's a good launching point for the upcoming conversation with Monalisa. So now let's get into that, the nitty-gritty of the ASEAN Summit that just concluded under the 2025 chair, Malaysia. Welcome to the show, Dr. Monalisa Adhikari, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at the University of Stirling in Scotland.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let's get straight into the statement that came at the end of the ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur this week. So Southeast Asian leaders said they were, quote, deeply concerned about the violence and the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Myanmar, but they held back from taking any further action or signalling any further action. They reiterated that the 5-point consensus, which was made with Senior General Min Aung Hlaing after his coup, that it's the main reference to addressing the crisis in Myanmar, They also called for extensions of the earthquake ceasefires, but they didn't note that those ceasefires were broken as soon as they were announced and have been broken countless times since. So the ASEAN statement has really been received pretty negatively by most observers. Monet, are we now certain that ASEAN under Malaysian leadership is just going to be more of the same, no enforcement, no action on Myanmar?
Well, there was a lot of hopes attached to the Malaysian chairmanship. So with the summit now over, it does look like it's more of the same. However, I think we need to sort of differentiate between Malaysia as a state engaging in the conflict or the internal crisis in Myanmar and Malaysia as an ASEAN chair working within the institutional constraints of ASEAN. And given the constraints like consensus-based decision-making, differences within different member states with regards to ASEAN's mandate, especially on engaging on internal crisis, but also absence of an institutional architecture to deal with complex political issues, means that even if Malaysia was to commit to engaging much more intensively, it would be inhibited by the regional and the institutional context. But if you look at Malaysia as a country, within the ASEAN, it's seen to be on the progressive side when it comes to Myanmar issues, whether it's about raising issues of the Rohingya crisis or informally engaging with the need to informally engage with the national unity government, or even outlining the need to engage with multiple constituencies in Myanmar, not just the SAC and the national unity government. It has been in the front line. But also, I think beyond Myanmar, there's been a recent research by BSREP, which is a research consortium based at the University of Edinburgh, which highlighted that Malaysia is one of the top 10 de facto third party in peace agreements, which means that it has signed peace agreements either as facilitator, observer, as a witness. And a lot of it has got to do with the Mindanao peace process, where Malaysia was a facilitator, but it's also been a part of multiple other processes, Cambodia, Southern Thailand, and even as a member to the Bonn Conference in Afghanistan in 2011. So this is a country that is exposed to, understands and engages on international complex transitions, political processes and transitions. I also think that we think that it's more of the same because newer developments in Myanmar, especially in light of the earthquake now, are outpacing ASEAN's ability to respond. So every year it feels like ASEAN's lagging behind because the pace of developments within the country is much more faster. But I think more positively, I think there were 4 very small but notable departures with the Malaysian chairmanship. And I just wanted to point and talk about those. So one, I think, was the discussion of the appointment of a special envoy for Myanmar. So since the initial launch of the 5-point consensus, a lot has been said about the limits posed by the current arrangement. The ASEAN envoy is appointed on a yearly basis by the ASEAN chair, which leaves very little time to deliver and engage on very constructively on Myanmar. And this summit has formally taken that up, and I think that is notable. Much of it was just talking between civil society groups for a very long time. And I think second, I think there's been an explicit recognition of the Myanmar issue as a regional one, or one that has regional implication. So you mentioned the statement by ASEAN, and in that statement, it really links the current crisis to increase in transnational crimes, drug trafficking, human trafficking, online scams. Now, I think this is quite important. This is something that people have been talking about, but it's featured much more formally in a statement. And I think it's also important because framing of this crisis as a regional one and not as an internal affair of the state of Myanmar allows ASEAN then not to be limited by debates on sovereignty, non-intervention, or it being an internal affair, which historically, like we know, has been the case. And I think the third would be this call for not only extending but expanding the ceasefire. And I think that expansion is quite important. And now, like you started with, a starting point could be that it could be questioned if there is a ceasefire at all, because it's been continually broken, fighting has continued, and in many contexts, aerial attacks have actually increased. But if you look at Myanmar's history, there's been a history of ceasefire since the 1980s, late 1980s. And they've barely gone beyond ceasefires to substantively talk about political issues. But they've also been very limited to small territories, very localized ceasefire in northern areas in Kachin until 2007-2008, in Rakhine between 2020 to 23, of course, intermittently broken. And what we see with those ceasefires is that they've just displaced the conflict from one part of the country to another. So without a comprehensive expansion of the ceasefire, you'd just be tactically deflecting conflicts to other parts. So, for instance, when there was a thaw in the conflict in Rakhine in the aftermath of the ceasefire, there were much intense fightings in Shan and Chin, right? So I think this expansion of ceasefire is quite important, both for humanitarian needs, but also for it to be incrementally built into something more substantive. And lastly, I think there was a recognition of the difficulty of the political dialogue in the current context in Myanmar. And for the last couple of years, it's just been, there will be an inclusive dialogue. But I think this statement notes that the trust deficit is high and dialogue is a difficult process. And I think that iron and almost a recognition of that difficulty is important to sort of carve out the pathway ahead.
All right, it's nice to hear a more optimistic interpretation of that language about expanding the ceasefire. Thank you for those 4 points. But even so, I think we both agree it's fair to criticise ASEAN for not doing much in general. But I want to flip that and now talk about what it does not do. That's still important. Since the 5-point consensus was agreed upon 4 years ago, ASEAN has not invited high-ranking SAC officials to its meetings. That's an achievement in itself of sorts, as some ASEAN members would be more than happy to have the Myanmar military sitting at the table. Another thing ASEAN may not do is endorse the SAC's planned elections. Malaysian Foreign Minister Muhammad Hassan said at a press conference on Sunday that the SAC must fully comply with the 5-point consensus before it holds any election, and that there's no point having an election if it's only partially participated in by the people of Myanmar. Now, such an election would not be a priority for ASEAN, he says. I quote, "What's the point if it's all a whitewash to cover up in the eyes of the international community?" Well, that's strong language from the foreign minister, but it's not the same as ASEAN categorically refusing to recognise the election. So I ask you, what are the factors involved in ASEAN recognising the military's planned elections for December or January?
Absolutely. I think it's important to recognize that ASEAN over the years has handled this question of recognition of governments quite constructively and quite innovatively. These are very tricky legal and political questions. And with competing recognition claims by the NUG and SAC, it puts ASEAN in a difficult place. And while it has not recognized ASEAN NUG formally, it has also not legitimized the SAC, like you mentioned. And it has also been quite conscious that some of its actions might unintentionally legitimize the SAC. And I think this is in response to the public outcry about ASEAN's initial engagement with the SAC just after the coup, but also and because of SAC's unwillingness to deliver on the 5-point consensus, which really means that ASEAN policies have also reflected on and embedded public perceptions in Myanmar. And I think that is sort of notable in itself. On elections, I think 2 things are important, both which you sort of highlighted. One, that ASEAN representatives have highlighted that the elections needs to be inclusive, in that they would like to see all parties being able to contest at the bare minimum. And second, that they've also recognized that peace is the priority and elections are not. And I think so. I think that is those have been the 2 factors which has sort of drawn ASEAN's prioritization or ASEAN's thinking on these elections. So it remains to be seen if those 2 parameters are strictly followed by all states within ASEAN. So it remains to be seen if ASEAN will recognize an election where some of the most credible political forces have refused to participate. Others have been simply barred from participating. And also, if elections are a measure of the legitimate will of the Burmese people, with fighting ongoing in 13 regions and states as the UN states, it will not be credible or representative for it to be recognized as a collective will of the Burmese people. So I think it does put a lot of complexity in terms of whether that election would be called an election and legitimized. However, I think on the flip side, if ASEAN were to recognize the planned election, it'll really be, at least to my mind, because of two rather pragmatic reasons. One, I think a hope that it will lead to some form of a democratic transition that can perhaps be incrementally built onto something more credible, to a pathway to peace, perhaps, and will allow taking on board legitimate will of the people, like I mentioned. Now, this optimism might be very misplaced. I would think it is. But if you look at it from a regional perspective, this isn't a region which flares very well on issues of democracy or democratization. And even if you take a cursory look at the Freedom House's data, which categorizes states as free, partly free, and not free based on multiple measures of political freedom, civic liberties, none of the ASEAN states are classed as free, right? So you have Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore as partly free, and the rest is not free, which really means that a minimalist threshold for democracy with elections, however faulty, might just fit the bill, right? And I think second, any form of election also perhaps marks a shift from the current status quo and almost as a form of exit for ASEAN's engagement, right? So ASEAN leaders have been quite vocal in the fact that they wouldn't want a Myanmar issue to dominate the regional agenda. There are multiple other issues. So it also allows for some sort of an exit of some form. Now, when we look at political transitions globally, it is not new for elections to be exit points. In the last 3 decades, the UN has almost operated on a procedure or a formula where after a minimal level of peace is obtained, there is an election is held, the UN hands over power to the incumbent and just debates, right? So it could be one of those things, but from my own perspective, I think an election might just derail that process rather than being a credible incremental pathway. If it's held, there will be a time for election. I just don't think it is now.
Thank you for that overview. Now, I wanted to return to something you mentioned earlier. The annual rotating ASEAN special envoys to Myanmar, well, they've all failed to make any progress. And as you said this week at the summit, there was discussion about changing the policy to appoint a sort of more permanent special envoy for Myanmar, possibly on a 3-year term. Everyone seems to agree this would be a good idea, but we haven't heard anything more since those discussions were reported. So how do you see the benefits of a 3-year term for the new envoy?
So I think a key advantage of a 3-year term, one is time, and the other is having an institutional focal point to engage on Myanmar. And when I say time, it's time to deliver on the 5-point consensus at the very minimal, to at least discuss and have some form of engagement on the humanitarian assistance side of things, but also the time to plan for the medium term, if not the long term, which allows for both, I think, the broadening, but also the deepening of that engagement. So however optimistic you are, the problem needs some form of a medium to long-term solution, right? So I think that time becomes very important. And as it stands, this annual rotating envoy means that Myanmar just becomes this burning ball that's been passed every year. So with nobody having the time to adequately even reflect and incrementally build on the prior engagement. And in terms of time, I think, especially if you look at the scale of fragmentation in Myanmar, which is unparalleled, you have the ethnic armed organizations, multiple of them commanding different parts of the territory, governing many parts of the territory. You have the National Unity Government, the SAC, the PDFs, and almost shifting relations between many of them, all of whom will need to be engaged with and brought on board if any idea of inclusive dialogue that ASEAN has prioritized or talked about is to be delivered on. So that needs a scale of engagement that would need a longer time horizon. If you just look at the opposition in Myanmar, while united in their opposition against the junta, their differences especially with regards to fundamental demands like federalism. So any political dialogue on these key issues will need a long time to iron out differences, to plan for the transitional period and then the future. So some form of a long-term, medium to long-term planning would be enabled by a longer time horizon. It would also be beneficial to have a 3-year term because it would allow the special envoy and perhaps his office to establish themselves as an institutional focal point, a home that can broker continued conversations between ASEAN and the international community on Myanmar, as well as ASEAN and the conflict actors. All parties can liaise with the ASEAN Special Envoy's office, which also sort of mainstreams that the engagement. So I think those are some of the key advantages of having a longer term horizon for the envoy.
That makes sense. Yep. And so I want to ask you also about the procedural elements. Do you think ASEAN would simply upgrade the current envoy, Othman Hashim, to a 3-year term? How would it work procedurally to appoint this envoy? Would nationality and the rotating chairmanship be a factor, or could it be just straight up more merit based?
I think it would really depend on the kind of. I think one, it would depend on Malaysia. There have been prior proposals of a troika, the past chair, the present chair, and the future chair. So it could be the troika deciding on some of these, but it could also, because if it's seen to be as a much more longer term sort of a mandate, it would need some form of a consensus between other members, not just the past, present, and the future chair. So, and if it's, I think there is a recognition of the complexity of the Myanmar issue. So, I think someone who has contextual knowledge about the conflict, the actors, the civic space, the challenges, who perhaps has experience in other international context or in the Myanmar context, and has the trust to enable for a domestic solution, I think would be prioritized, just because I think there is a recognition that 5-point consensus has not moved. So I think merit in the sense of understanding the contextual specificities will be prioritized, will at least need to be prioritized.
All right, that's realistic. Thanks. Now, I want to broaden this a little bit. ASEAN's failures often brings the conversation back to Myanmar's largest two neighbours, that's India and China. Now, China's been getting more and more directly involved in post-coup Myanmar's affairs since 2023. It's displaying its control over armed groups, and it brokered a major ceasefire between the military and the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army. That led to the Myanmar military retaking Lashio. And this year, Min Aung Hlaing has had side meetings with both Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. I know that you've done research, you've put some thought into how ASEAN could cooperate further with India and China for positive change in Myanmar. So why do you recommend that, and how does it happen?
Absolutely. I think it would be nice to see ASEAN sort of, by ASEAN's own admission, it's said that ASEAN cannot do it alone. So it would be nice to have regional partners like India and China that share borders, that have a lot of leverage on different conflict parties, that dominate the political economy, to be embedded within that ASEAN mechanism, either as group of friends of Myanmar type mechanism or a multi-party facilitation team. So I think there are multiple modalities in which they could be brought forth. At the very least, I think working with India and China, it would enable a concerted effort on Myanmar and a coherence in terms of the regional engagement. As it stands, we have, like you mentioned, India and China's bilateral engagement, despite their commitment to ASEAN's 5-point consensus, which has really increased the scale of fragmentation of different international actors engaging in Myanmar. So we have the 5-point consensus led by ASEAN. We have a very localized dialogue mechanism by China that brings different northern-based ethnic armed organizations to Yunnan sometimes, to different other areas other times, to talk about some of ceasefires, humanitarian assistance type issues. And more recently, we've also had Indian government and civil society groups engage with ethnic armed organizations in the India-Myanmar borderlands, the KIO, the CNF, the Arakan Army, along with the SAC, recently in the pretext of different workshops and Track 2 initiative, but we know that these are multiple initiatives that have been launched So essentially, we have multiple disaggregated forms of engagement that rarely cross paths. So it would be nice to have a concerted regional effort, if not global, especially as the UN and different Western states have been busy and occupied with Ukraine and Gaza. It would be nice to have that regional concerted effort. I think more specifically, I think there are two aspects of the 5-point consensus where India and China could be useful. So one, establishing humanitarian corridors to deliver aid from Indian and Chinese borderlands. Like we know, much of the focus has been in the Thai-Myanmar borderlands, which has posed logistical challenges to sort of almost reach into different parts of the country. So this could be a starting point. Both India and China have a long history of humanitarian assistance, post-disasters, not post-political crisis, but humanitarian assistance nonetheless. And this could also, humanitarian could also provide, relief could also provide an opening to incrementally build towards more other substantive political issues like political dialogue on different things. I think that's one. The second is, I think, using the Indian and Chinese networks, especially using their economic, political, and normative leverage that they have on different state and non-state parties within Myanmar to at least commit to immediate end of violence. That could be the starting point for a much more long-term solution. However, I also do recognize that might seem very idealistic. I feel that India and China have some capacity, not as much as it's often made out to be, to sort of influence the dynamics in Myanmar, but perhaps not the interest. So there's the capacity, but not the interest to venture into any form of engagement that is beyond its immediate strategic or economic interest. So I do think that it might seem more idealistic, but I think of all the parties that are there, I think ASEAN would be one of the only regional actors or global actors that would be able to bring parties like India and China together into a framework.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. The last question I want to ask you is going broader again, which is to ask you about your original PhD study as you became an academic. It was on partly the peace process in Myanmar before the coup. So I just wanted to ask you about that research, what you learned, and how you see the prospects for peace in Myanmar going forward, given the devastation wrought by the 2021 coup.
Thank you for the question. So for my PhD, I focused on how different forms of international engagement shape political and peace processes and their outcomes. I'm looking at Nepal and Myanmar. And I think Myanmar was quite unique and special because of the kind of twin transition that it had. There was almost a simultaneous transition from conflict to peace and authoritarianism to democracy, which meant that negotiations weren't bipartite like you see in most peace processes. It wasn't the state and rebel group or multiple rebel groups, but rather it was the state, the democratic opposition, and different ethnic armed organizations, tripartite dialogue between these three actors, and alignment between these actors sort of shaped the pace of the process. So Nepal was in a similar moment in 2001 to 2006. And had there been an alignment between the democratic opposition, led by the NLD then, and the EAOs concretely agreeing on substantive issues, I think would have seen a very different direction that Myanmar could have taken. So I think that was one of the unique points that I see in Myanmar. But I think the other thing that pointed directly was this interaction between the global context and the Myanmar conflict, both of which are acutely fragmented, have shaped the contours of the Myanmar's peace process, both the scale and the pace. So that we have an international context where the multiple states, China, India, US, Thailand, Japan, engaging very differently, but also very competitively, bringing their own norms, practices, and interests into the peace process. So while it's often framed as a regional versus the global, when it comes to talking about Myanmar's international relations, there's not one single regional approach in Myanmar. The Indians differ substantively from the Chinese. And also the type of engagement was very different. It was a very parochial form of engagement where the Chinese talk to the northern-based ethnic armed organizations, but not to the ones across the Thailand border. There was also quite ambivalent to ideas of, if not agnostic to ideas such as human rights, inclusive governance, which did not create incentives for conflict parties in Myanmar for these agendas to be pushed through. On the other hand, there was a scale of conflict fragmentation, multiple actors, various interests, and how all of them interacted very differently with different sets of international actors. So I think that interaction between the conflict dynamics and the global fragmentation allowed for conflict actors, especially like the Burmese military, to sort of capitalize on this internal and external divides and sort of dominate that political settlement. So you had 10 years of peace process, very little agreement on pretty much anything substantive. But I think linking the prior peace process to the current state, I think one of the things to note is I think the failed peace processes and ceasefires that have gone badly wrong in Myanmar have created legacies where people do not trust future processes. So there have been ceasefires since the 1980s, which have either been broken, never implemented, or not gone beyond ceasefires to any substantive political dialogue on key grievances of the conflict. So I think there's a lot of peace process fatigue, and a lot of the hesitance that we now see in terms of proposals to dialogue, I think is owed at least partly to the trust deficit because of the past. And in terms of the prospects, I think that's a very difficult question. I do think that people are angry with the state of Myanmar, and hence any anti-military agenda is likely to be popular. But I think less talked about is people are also very wary and fatigued by the conflict and the mounting economic deprivation. So I think which will create bottom-up pressures for conflict parties to seek some solution, whether it's in the battlefield or it's in the peace talks. So as it stands, I don't see a comprehensive peace process or a settlement with golden handshakes between different actors coming anytime soon. But I think there are two trends that I think is sort of gaining ground. One is much more of a collaborative engagement between different parts of the opposition. These are military and non-military forms of coordination. And there are already forums talking about how do we govern in the interim period, how do we take it on further. So I think that would set the pace for what happens next. And I think the second is also a much more localized bottom-up forms of peace and inclusive governance that we see in contexts like Karenni, where women have 30% representation in all sectors of the state. It has tried to cohere a lot of these different actors within the subnational arrangement. So I think that kind of model will be scaled and emulated and built on. I think those are the kind of things that I'd see would be what we see in Myanmar going forward.
Bottom-up inclusive peace. Yes, I hope for that too. Now, this is a good time for us to stop, but I really appreciate you giving us this international politics perspective on ASEAN and Myanmar's, complex peace problem. So thank you, Mona.
Thank you so much for having me, Luke.
Now, if you want to hear more about ASEAN and the origin of the 5-point consensus, harken back to episode 18 of What's Happening in Myanmar in your podcast app of choice. That episode, from 3 months ago, featured Evan Laxmana, who's currently attending the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, along with some delegates from Myanmar. And of course, media outlets, including Frontier Myanmar, will bring you any relevant news from that dialogue on next week's episode. Until then, don't forget to check out the new content on the website, including a feature on newly settled Kaman people in Yangon struggling with discrimination. And as ever, please get in touch with your feedback on the show. We love it. Email whimyanmar@proton.me. Thanks for keeping up for another week with What's Happening in Myanmar. Until next time, farewell and take care.